which is a little bit more than a year ago now. So first today I'd like to talk a little bit about what the process of writing the LBOR, the Lesbian Bill of Rights, was like. And after that I'll go on a bit about why I think it's important that we all be active in a diversity of spaces. More on that later. So I participated in writing the first draft of the LBOR. Lauren says I wrote it. I think that's a stretch, but I was there. Going into it, I thought it would be easy. Lesbians are female homosexuals, they have the right to not be correctively raped, and you keep going like that for another page, maybe two, and then you're done. Quick and easy, right? It turns out that even just brainstorming the first version was much more difficult than I had expected. It's tricky to figure out where the exclusive boundary around lesbian rights is. There's a lot of overlap with human rights, women's rights, same-sex attracted rights. The result is that the exact line is hard to find. Lesbians have the right to clean water, for example, but so does everyone else. Lesbians have the right to education, and again, so does everyone else, and this is especially applicable to the women of the world. Some things are so universal that they're not worth including, and yet other things that should be universal are not necessarily applied equally. So we tried then to find the rights that are exclusive to lesbians. That narrowed the field somewhat, but was still difficult. And sometimes we were faced with the question of what to do when we don't necessarily support a system, but excluding lesbians from it would be discriminatory. For example, although disclaimer, WDI USA has not yet taken an official position on it, it is widely recognized among radical feminists that marriage is a patriarchal institution that treats a woman as property in order to extract labor from her. However, preventing same-sex marriage is discrimination, so where does this leave us? Questions like this, and others, were controversial. In this specific case, we ultimately decided that, quote, lesbians have the right to make private domestic agreements with their sexual partners that are as enforceable as any other contract without having to enter into a state-defined marriage. And this workaround allowed us to avoid the question of marriage while acknowledging that women in long-term relationships have the right to create contracts of their own and that these contracts should be taken seriously. Somewhat similarly, we did not directly address the question of adoption itself, nor did we claim that everyone has a right to adopt children. Rather, we argued that lesbians have the right to be free from discrimination in this realm. So getting to a point of more or less agreement with everyone in the caucus was difficult, but I think we're all quite pleased with the LBOR in its present state. It's comprehensive without being too long, and we have an increasing amount of international signatures by global lesbian organizations, a couple representatives of which have come from Germany to be here with us this weekend. And this international network in particular is a development that I'm really excited about. So in a bit of a shift, the second thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is my experience at a local women's music festival. This was 2 years ago when we went, my partner and I and a few other radical feminists. And the reason I want to talk about this experience together with that of crafting the LBOR is because, as I said, we struggled through a lot of disagreements and assumptions while writing and editing it. Belonging predominantly to one group or type of group makes us assimilate to its culture and norms, and that makes it more difficult to deal with disagreement from people who come from places with different norms and customs. So back to the music festival. While it's technically inclusive, of course, we did not actually see any men in attendance. It's small, declining, not their sort of scene, I guess. We discovered upon arriving that it was actually not only a women's music festival, but a primarily lesbian festival. I would guess at least 90%, if not more. We were pretty surprised by this, but in hindsight, we should not have been. We should have included ahead of time by a lot of things like the name of the campground, cap out, the capital O, the group weddings they performed every year, and the rainbow flags all over the website. Anyway, it was a pleasant surprise. So that was my first experience in such a place, and the long weekend at the campground left me with a few key takeaways. First, it reminded me of the fact that in-person spaces tend to be very different from online spaces. This is known, but it bears repeating. If you frequent lesbian or sapphic spaces online and don't engage much with other same-sex attracted women in might be left thinking that we spend most of our time arguing about trivial controversies, such as the precise definition of a gold star lesbian. This is, shockingly, not an experience I have ever had except for online, where people behave as if it's the #1 concern. I don't mean to denigrate online spaces, but at the same time it's necessary to remember that they portray a very specific and often skewed view of the world. Ultimately, you don't know whether the person you're talking to is the local wrecker or a TRA going undercover. You don't know if her sexuality is what she says it is, and you don't even know if she is actually a she. So we should make use of online spaces, but I don't think we should be satisfied with just that, which maybe does not mean saying to the women who showed up here today. But online is not enough, and more than that, I think we have to more generally diversify the types of spaces in which we participate. Not only online versus in person, but also explicitly feminist versus yes lesbian, but not explicitly feminist spaces like the festival, as well as others. For example, there are groups that are oriented around social connections like book clubs, and those oriented around action like protest groups. Engaging with both is not contradictory. After all, as we've heard before, the personal is political. I've always felt very comfortable in feminist spaces, or at least in radical feminist spaces. I feel at home with the theory, I love the shared references and the principles and the solidarity, and I have always felt that I have as much of a right to feminism as any other woman does. And yet, I do know women, feminists, radical feminists, who stutter every time they say the words gay or lesbian. I know otherwise intelligent and highly competent women who very mysteriously need everything explained to them 3 times if it has anything to do with lesbians. I'm not saying it's their fault. The patriarchy seeks to divide us, etc., etc. The training we get when we're young can be hard to undo. But it can be tiresome and disconcerting, especially when it's coming from women with whom you're otherwise very much on the same wavelength. That just makes it more jarring. The music festival we were at was the first space of different kind I'd ever been in. Not feminist, but still centering women, still lesbian by a vast majority. Most of the women there called themselves country dykes, and probably 99% of them carried multiple pocket knives. As a band of 5 same-sex attracted radical feminists from the big-ish city, we almost felt like the outliers for once. It was a novelty. It was a different experience compared to the feminist-oriented gatherings like here to which we're used to. Our radical feminism came up, and a few women we were talking to only seemed very vaguely confused by it and not particularly interested. Most of the attendees didn't seem to think of themselves as women, but as lesbians first and maybe only. And yet there they were, having created a festival, complete with campground and cabins for the disabled women, and a 2-day lineup of all-female musicians, and 3 meals a day. Sure, it wasn't perfect. Notably, there was the glaring fact that the event was technically inclusive, and although no men showed up, they could have. And yet throughout the long weekend of that event, we didn't, luckily, see a single man. And I don't think men even really came up in our conversations with other women. They pretty much didn't exist. The woman centering was constant, effortless, and pretty much universal. So based off these experiences and some others, I want to make the argument that feminist spaces are the theory, and the spaces of everyday, non-feminist lesbians are the practice. They're 2 sides of the same coin. Participating in these spaces does come with different frustrations, like when talking to straight feminists. Why is she telling me about her piece of shit husband again when she doesn't let me criticize him? What is the point of this? Or alternatively, when talking to non-feminist lesbians, how can she be a lifelong lesbian and man-hater and think men won't take advantage of every opportunity we give them? But the reality is that we need each other. The frustrations are different, but the benefits are different too. The everyday lesbians of the world, living their lives, centering women, need the structured analysis of feminism, the theory. And the feminists of the world need to see how it looks to live the way lesbians do, centering women and loving women, not just in theory, but also in practice, all day on the ground. We need the personal and the political. Because the thing is that neither approach works without the other. The spaces that non-feminist lesbians have developed, like the Women's Music Festival, are wonderful and lovely. But their lack of class analysis and explicit feminist theory creates a massive vulnerable spot. They create the risk that men who claim to be women could undo everything that they've created, the things that some women have dedicated their lives to. Similarly, explicitly feminist spaces do a lot to raise consciousness and generate new ideas and push feminist thought forward. But their weakness, as I see it, is that what goes on in feminist spaces can be a bit overly abstract. There's a lot of talking about ideas, but not necessarily as much putting them into action, not as much concrete centering of women. Ultimately, I want to argue that it is useful for us to be active in as many different types of spaces and types of groups as possible. Not only online, but also in person, not only lesbian or feminist, but both, at least for those of us who are lesbians. And this is not only because we have things to learn from each other, but also because these spaces have differing customs and norms. To spend time in spaces with different customs facilitates cultural exchange and broader understanding. It helps keep us from making assumptions or cultural blunders, much the way learning a language does. When one of the primary goals of male supremacy is to divide women, increased understanding of one another and solidarity with one another is invaluable. And I think we can find that through increased familiarity with the different subgroups and types of spaces that are all around us. So we should not limit ourselves.